Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of Science of the Times. So I'm here, Simon Khalid, and Tim.
Hello, I'm Tim Colson.
So, Tim, turns out that the lovely Sonia is away on a field trip in Borneo this week.
I
So how,
I
how are
know
you
my wife, lovely wife Sonia, has abandoned me for a couple of weeks. She's teaching our biology undergraduates in Borneo, so I'm having to fend for myself. Do all the dog walking, and I suspect I'll probably be having sausages for tea. I've also been trying to do some DIY while she's away.
how's that been going?
I'm just as well, I'm not a lab scientist. I am so hopeless at DIY. I've now taken a gate, put a gate up and taken it down three times because I haven't done it properly. But I think this time it's going to work. How about you? What have you been up to? How's your week been?
It's been a fair bit of travel. I was away in Tuscany, then got back, and I've been listening and watching the Champions League. Delightfully seeing PSG defeat and put out Arsenal.
Well,
Looking
and I
forward.
should say, and this is obviously difficult, but congratulations, Liverpool, for winning the Premiership. Yeah, I know.
Certainly looking forward to that guard of honor by from Arsenal at the weekend.
Yeah. Anyway, this week our guest is Paul Behrens, and he's an expert on sustainability and how we get there. It turns out we're not doing a great job in the West, at least, of living very sustainably.
No, but from what I've read from his recent works, it turns out that it's not all doom and gloom. There's some great deal of optimism if we act fairly soon, right?
I think that's right. So it's not it we do have to do something. Humanity has to do something. There are challenges, there's no doubt about them. But I think what's amazing is people like Paul, who's come from a physics background, is someone, he's clearly a very smart man who's thought a lot about this, very broad in terms of his knowledge. And when you hear people like that kind of laying out what the challenges are, but also saying that we can find solutions, but we need to act quickly, that has to be a message of hope, I think.
Absolutely. And when it comes from a pure scientist, I think there's no other hidden agenda. It's not it's not a politician or it's not someone who's got something to sell or to gain other than just just that humanity thrives.
No, it's true. Well, he does have a book, but and it's well worth reading. Actually, I must admit, I haven't quite finished it because we only managed to set up this podcast a few days ago, but I've been reading it quickly, so I'm nearly there. It's thoroughly recommended, and it's
We'll include a link
yeah,
with
the best
the
of times, the worst of times, but we'll do that anyway. Should we get him on?
yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Okay, so hi Paul, it's lovely to have you here as our guest today for this episode of Science of the Times. Would you like to introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Hi, lovely to be with you both. So I am a professor at the University of Oxford. I am broadly an industrial ecologist, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. How can you be an industrial ecologist? But one of the things that it allows you to do is think about the human systems like ecosystems as well. And so you can think about how the systems itself responds to different pressures like climate change, and how we can change that system for the better. So like reduce the environmental damage.
So Paul, you actually started off life as a physicist, is that right?
Yeah, so I was a physicist originally, and then I worked on telescopes for a while. So I was doing a little bit of astronomy. But I decided to come back down to Earth because I was thinking there's a lot of problems with the environment here. And so over time, I've moved more and more towards, I would say, the sort of environmental social sciences. So trying to look at how do we fit on this planet? What are the impacts we're having on this planet? And what are the major roadblocks that we have for moving towards a sustainable future that's better for us?
And you've written a number of papers on this that we'll come across, but you relatively recently had a book out called "The Best of Times, the Worst of Times: Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science," and that's published and available by the Indigo Press, and it's on audio. It's on the audio book as well, and I can thoroughly recommend it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So in the book, I really wanted to get at this question of what kind of hope do we have for the future? What's the path that we're on? and what's the best we can expect? Because I think a lot of people are struggling at the moment with this idea of doom and gloom about the environment. And this sort of amorphous doom where we can't really, express it is not very helpful for anyone. It can switch you off from being active. And then it's the agency, it's the being active that then gives you the hope. And so I was seeing a lot of books coming out, which were either very negative, it's the end of the world type books, or really positive. Oh my God, we've got these amazing technologies, it'll be wonderful. And as a scientist who works on, okay, well, what are the actual physical limits to some of these things that they're talking about? And what can we expect from climate change and environmental crises? What does it actually look like, the future? And so I took paired chapters of pessimism and hope in different areas. And so the pessimism is largely the trajectory that we're on. And then the hope is a reasonable hope for the future. So it's not a utopia. It's what can we expect are some of the trends that we see happening now, and would they be better than a future than we could possibly imagine now compared to the future that we're expecting? And so that made it quite interesting. So talking to people, because some people are really pessimistic already, and they go, "Oh my God, you're so hopeful," and there's some people who are really hopeful, and they go, "Oh my God, you're so pessimistic."
So you want to read the pessimism chapter in each pair in the morning, so you can have a sort of slightly down lunch, but then read the more optimistic future one before you go to bed.
That's exactly right. What I say to people is never finish on a pessimistic chapter before going to sleep. And I've heard people do that and then they've lost sleep. So do not do that.
So, Paul, when you're even beginning to sort of think about tackling a project like that, it seems, I think, if thinking, I'm putting myself in your shoes now and thinking, don't think I'd even know where to start. So, what was your starting point?
So it's a really big question, isn't it? Where we're heading. And my starting point was really, what are the long-term changing dynamics within our societies that we're seeing? So in terms of the population demographics, in terms of consumption, and then look into the different areas which are further away from, say, the natural sciences. So, for example, looking at demographics and population inequality first, and then moving into energy, which is a very fundamental requirement for human flourishing, then food, then looking into climate change and what that means for the future in those different sectors, and then into the economics. And then looking towards the future, basically. So, you get more speculative as you move more and more through the book, because ultimately we don't really know what's going to happen to politics and democracies and these big questions about how we organize society. But you can say physically, this is what's going to happen on the ground due to climate change. Like, we know, for example, that we will have sea level rise, we will have crop failures, we will have all these things from climate change. We might not know exactly how and when, but we know they're going to happen. So let's describe that and how we can deal with that before we move on to all of these things about how we organize society.
But won't we also have better crops and better materials and new technology and machine learning and AI saving us from all of these challenges ahead?
Well, I think some of that is wishful thinking. I think some of there's a role for some of it. And so I talk about that in the book. Ultimately, though, if we had started these transitions that we knew we needed to start in the late 80s, the 1990s, we might have been able to hold on to some of these practices. They may still not have been healthy for us. For example, in the future, we know we're going to have to have some dietary shifts, and we know we're going to have to make some shifts in the way we move ourselves around on the planet. And if we'd started early enough, maybe some of those technological solutions, for example, for flying, might have been developed by now. But unfortunately, we have such a short timescale now to make the changes we need. For example, to meet 1.5 degrees, which is the major climate target a lot of people talk about, we would need reductions now above 10% in the emissions year on year, more than we saw during COVID. And in fact, arguably, we're moving through 1.5 degrees right now. We really need extremely fast reductions, even for 2 degrees. So what this implies is we need both the technology and the social and behavioral change now. We need to do everything everywhere all at once.
And which one, in a way, I guess it's difficult to tell which one's more difficult, right? The technological changes or the societal behavioral changes, and the latter won't be even across the whole planet either, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's really it is hard to sort of see how different sort of interventions, different technologies and different social changes, how fast they can really move. We do know though that yes, technologies can be very powerful. Once we get the costs down for technologies, we start to adopt them anyway. So the big example on this is renewable technology. So the renewable technologies of wind and solar, for example, have come down massively in price. We call this a learning rate. So the learning rates that we've seen in wind and solar have been mind-blowingly good. So when we thought so when you look at in history and you look at, say, the Model T Ford, which is a great example of doing things at scale, for every doubling of Model T Fords on the road, you would get a reduction of about 14.5% in the cost of the Model T Ford. So it would come down in price as you did more of it. For solar, it's mind-blowing. It's way above 20%. So it's much faster reductions. And so, yeah, some of these technologies are absolutely vital and, they are really coming at the right time in the energy system. But the problem often is integrating them into the system. So, having the transmission lines, having the market dynamics, making sure that the fossil fuel companies move out of the way. These are all social questions. And those things tend to take time. Now, on the social changes question, what we do know is that humans learn from each other. We're sort of these intelligent apes that we interact, and we know that there's a contagion of ideas as well. And so when we see over time, we can see these sorts of tipping elements in societies as they shift from one practice to another. And the research there seems to suggest that if you get enough people involved in a new practice, let's take dietary change, for example. If we start moving towards plant-based diets, and we can talk about why that's sort of absolutely essential later. But if we look at the numbers of people adopting that behavior, it turns out that between about 15 and 40% is the number of people you need adopting that behavior. And then that tends to flip the majority. So you'll still have some people eating meat, you still have, those practices, but it will be just much less because you'll tip into a different thing. So, it depends where you are on these sort of adoption curves, both these technological adoption curves and these sort of social adoption curves. And, as I say, things tend to move in contagion with this. And so once you're over that tipping point, things can change really quickly, and in food systems especially. I mean, when I was growing up, there wasn't such a thing as avocado on toast. That was not a thing, you know. So we adopt actually these changes much faster than we think. That our habits are far less ingrained than we think.
But do you
So
think also, sorry, Tim, go ahead.
go ahead, no, go on.
I was just going to say that do you think then that also puts a sort of perhaps a responsibility on when you understand these things to get out there and talk to people and lobby people and try to facilitate these behavioral changes or accelerate them if possible?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so, as a practicing scientist, I can we have a good consensus base now on how the food system has to change, how the energy system has to change. There are some discussions around 20% of the solutions, like, maybe there's more of a role for nuclear for some people, maybe there's more of a role for hydrogen for some people. At the edges, there's discussion, but in the scientific consensus, we kind of know how things will change or have to change. And I think there is a role for scientists to be involved in advocating for the science, at least. So the policymakers, the public know that's where the science is, because they're being told all sorts of other messages by largely vested interests. And so actually being able to describe exactly what the change is and how exciting that change is from scientists, I think is really important. And so I do think that we can be involved as scientists in helping people understand where that future is looking. And that's not necessarily activism, that's advocacy for what the scientific consensus is saying.
So what happens if we don't make these transitions? So what happens if we don't move fast, very quickly to renewables? And I'm not asking you to predict the future, but at what point does civilization collapse? Do you think it's, a decade, 100 years, 200 years? Or you're not
That's
going to be drawn on that? I know asking our scientists
Yeah.
to make predictions like that is always dangerous.
Well, as it said, prediction is hard, especially about the future.
Yeah.
And I think we can start to sort of draw the contours of this, though. So let's talk about what is collapse. I would say collapse is a reduction in complexity in society. So it's a simplification of things. And if we look at the society right now, we're looking at the complexity of economics, of technology, of AI, of administrative sectors. They have to do an awful lot now. And we're at a very, very high level of complexity. Now, if we have a look and zoom in into the food system, for example, I'm extremely worried about impacts in the next sort of couple of decades on the food system driving societal instability. And the reason is because we've systemically underestimated how bad things could get. The estimates for the amount of warming that we would expect for an amount of emissions have been pretty good through the years, although recently it's been higher even than we thought. But what we systemically underestimated, and I've got sort of various things that I talk about here, is that we've systemically underestimated those impacts. So what we thought would happen at about 5 degrees of warming back in 2001, for the same amount of warming, for the same amount of impacts, we now think these things would happen at around 2 degrees or just over 2 degrees.
Mm.
And it's the same thing for the ecological and environmental aggregate impacts. So what we're sort of saying here is that over time things have got a lot more scary. And this is one of the reasons why we've moved from 2 degrees to 1 degrees in a lot of the discussions. And actually, what's scary is some of these large scale changes in the planet. I mean, we are a planetary changing species. Some of these changes are potentially unfolding even lower than we thought, so even around 1.5 degrees. So things like these big ocean currents changing, these might be changing way earlier than we thought. So if we don't make these transitions, what this basically means is suffering for a lot of people around the world. And zooming in on this food system area, what the research suggests is as the temperature goes up, you get more and more impacts on bread baskets around the world. So to put some numbers to this, one study suggested that for pre-climate change times, so back in what we call the Holocene, so last century, we would expect a multi-bread basket failure. So this is a failure of at least 10% of yields across multiple bread baskets in maize once every 16 years. At 1.5 degrees, that goes up to once every 3 years. And at 2 degrees to once every 2 years. That is an extreme one because maize or corn is more sensitive, but you see this same jump to 1.5 degrees in the other. So the jump between yesterday and 1.5 degrees is much larger than 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. And so what the outcome of that is that you get food price inflation. So what you will see is food prices going up. Now, what's not talked about enough in the politics and media is estimates suggesting that about a third of the food price inflation that we saw in 2023, for example, was driven by climate change. Now, clearly, you've got these other inflationary effects. So you've got things like Ukraine, you've got the hangover from COVID. All of this matters. But what the climate change impacts do is they put another layer of stress on society. And then you can easily tip society over. And so what we saw during those periods was, well, public sector workers striking in this country, in high income countries. In middle income countries and lower income countries, you saw political decay and collapse. So that's where we're heading. And now the thing that really concerns me is that as we try to deal with these impacts over time, and it's not just in food systems, it's in infrastructure, it's in energy, it's all of these impacts, then those costs sap the government and the state the ability to deal with those changes. So basically, you're doing more and more what's called defensive expenditures. You're spending money on sea level defense, you're spending money on bailing people out, and then you don't have the investments or the resources because money ultimately is about, the apportion and the scarcity of resources. You don't have that to deal with the future. So you could quite easily see yourself getting into a little bit of a doom loop here, where you end up sort of going down the tubes a little bit. So
what you're saying, what you're saying, and just for our listeners, is we're starting to see signs that we need to act quickly, but we still have time, but we do need to act quickly. So we need to be doing things in the next decade or two to really address some of these issues.
I would say we need to be doing things in the coming years which are completely unprecedented in society to avoid these futures.
But there is some positives. So, for example, you're talking about tipping points in the food sector and what we eat. And I think you said, tipping points occur when you get to sort of 15 to 40% of the population doing a particular behavior. I think in the UK, back in 2023, a paper reported that we were already at 15% of the population being vegetarian. So we might be at that tipping point. And as you said, more and more people are putting solar on their houses. The UK has done quite well on wind farms. So, I don't want our listeners to think it's all gloom, but so there are some positives.
That's exactly right. And when I say unprecedented, that's not taking into account those tipping points. We know society can change really quickly. The other really important point for this is that everything that we do matters. Every action matters. So a lot of the things that we know we need to do for the food system and for the energy system would allow us to roll with the punches of climate change better. Because if you think about what that means for changing the landscape, for example, basically going towards plants, not fully plant-rich based diet, but going towards plants, frees up a huge amount of land. And that land would better absorb the floodwaters, the storm surges. It would lower the cost. It would lower the suffering for people. If we look at energy systems, when we have renewable energy in our system, we lower the air pollution massively. So millions of people are dying around the world from air pollution. Well, this move towards renewables isn't just a climate thing. It's an air pollution thing. It saves so much health. And it's the same thing for food. Actually, arguably, it's even more for food because food, if you look across the whole suite of different climate and environmental challenges, food systems, one of the largest ones.
Okay, so maybe on this positive note, we should take a little break, Tim and Paul, and head back in a couple of minutes.
That's great.
Hi, Tim. You're looking particularly snazzy today. What are you wearing?
I'm wearing a piece from a company called Grace and Garbo. And actually, you know a little bit more about them than I do, to be honest.
Yeah, you're right, I do. And
You're the fashion queen. Yeah.
I'm also wearing a piece from Grace and Garbo. So this is a delightful knitwear outfit set up in Birmingham. What they do is they source knitwear, quality knitwear from all around the world. So it's vintage, one-off pieces, many of which they then hand embellish, like the one you're wearing today with its beautiful purple flowers. And so they're big on sustainability. Nothing goes to waste. Everything is sort of recycled and reused. And if you want to know more about them, then have a look at the link beneath this episode.
And thank you very much to them for supporting our podcast. I hope their sales soar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Grace and Garbo.
Welcome back after having heard the message from our sponsors. So let us continue talking to Paul. We're talking about through some of the challenges, and mainly you've been talking about food, Paul. But one of the things that you've also talked about in your book and you've written papers on is actually some of the requirements that we will need to fulfill in an environmentally sustainable world, on our transition to an environmentally sustainable future, in terms of things like sand and cement and other materials. So I think you've done some work on actually working out what those demands are going to be and how they might be met as well. Perhaps you can give us an overview of some of your recent work in that area.
Yeah, no. So it's really an exciting transition that we're moving towards in the energy system. We've historically used a huge amount of materials. So, humans right now, we move more material than all the natural processes combined. I did one calculation for the book, which is that if you were to add up all the plastic that we produce and turn that into cling film, we could wrap the planet.
Wow.
The amount of concrete that we've used so far would be enough to cover the entire surface of the Earth, so that with about 2 millimeters. In a recent study, we looked at the total amount of materials used since 1970, and that would be equivalent to about 3 to 4 millimeters of the entire Earth's surface. So we use an awful lot. I mean, one of the favorite ones, I think, is the fact that just in terms of plastics, that there are probably more small Lego people on the planet than humans. They're definitely going to last longer than us. I tried to verify this because Lego used to do this, sort of report this over time. But when they realized it was getting very, very close to the number of humans on the planet, I think they decided it probably wasn't a good look. Um, anyway, so we look into sort of these vast material flows in society and how they're used and how they're integrated into society. So I think one of the interesting studies for your listeners that is on energy systems. So what we had a look at there was we know we need these materials for solar, for batteries, for wind turbines. And yeah, you can say these are fairly material intensive. They're physical things in society that are going to sit there. And people are really worried about this. They think, well, isn't this just more mining? Just more and more and more mining. And so what we wanted to do was have a look at, well, how does this compare? How does this compare to the mining we already do for coal, for example? We mine an awful lot of coal. And what we found was that even under a scenario where we use loads of materials, so lots of people get electric vehicles, lots of people get batteries, it's not necessarily the future that I would necessarily want to see. I would personally like to see more electric bikes, for example. But it's a future. We're making our life harder for ourselves by saying we need loads of materials. Even under that future, we would be extracting fewer materials than coal today, even under the peak year of that energy system rollout.
But
And we'd be,
coal's
yeah.
quite close to the surface often, isn't it? It's,
Mhm.
it's relatively easy to get out of the ground, but some of the other materials that we'll need, it's actually much more challenging, I think, to extract it. Although I suppose, people are mining, are extracting hydrocarbons, so oil at the moment from sort of 8 kilometers down and under 18,000 pounds per square inch and what have you. So I know
Well,
what your answer's going to. Maybe I've answered my question myself.
yeah, well, there is a bit of that, but also we looked at the amount of material moved as well. So we took that into account in the study. Also, interestingly, on the bringing things up from very deep underground, geothermal, for example, there are now companies looking at extracting these materials from the geothermal production. So, you could actually sort of have this combo where you're producing energy and you're also producing some of these materials for the transition. So we find that even under the peak period of this extraction, the amount of mining activity you'd need would be about 40% lower than the amount of mining we do for coal today. And that brings you to a second sort of question of, well, what do those materials, what's the comparison between those materials? Because for coal, we're constantly dragging it out of the planet and then we're burning it, putting it into the atmosphere, causing all these problems. But for the energy transition, it's embedded in society then. It's a physical thing. And that's an amazing thing because then you can continue to reuse it as much as you can. Of course, there's thermodynamic limits to that, but you can continue to reuse it. And so it's called a stock in society. So our energy system is then a physical thing rather than something that we're having to constantly extract. And coming back to that point about inflation, a large part of the total inflation that we experience is also due to energy prices. And if we have a stock of materials in society and it's very stable and we're just recycling it as much as possible, then we're far less exposed to that inflation that I mentioned before.
So why can't we use, sorry, Simon, why can't we use more hydrogen as a fuel? It's highly abundant, the most abundant element in the cosmos. Or what opportunities does nuclear fission hold, for example? Because you hear about fission reactors being made you're a physicist by training, and vast amounts of vast amounts of energy locked up there. And occasionally you'll hear in the news claims about these that we can go to a hydrogen-based energy system, or we can go to nuclear fission. Is that still pie in the sky? Is
So
too far
it's
off?
hydrogen. There's a lot of hydrogen on the planet, but unfortunately, it's bound up in other
Like
compounds.
in
So
water,
in water, like H2O. And unfortunately, to produce that hydrogen, we need to put a lot of energy into it. And the energy that we have to put into it really means the efficiencies of the hydrogen goes down massively. So if to take this to give a specific example, if we're using heat pumps that are powered by electricity, like renewables, you can get about 3 or 4 times the amount of heat out for the power that you're putting in. With hydrogen, it's a fraction of 1%, of one. of 100%. So you actually lose a lot of energy in that process. There will be roles for hydrogen because we need some hydrogen in industrial processes. And so we will need some amount of hydrogen. But what we've seen over time is that the role for hydrogen seems to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller as innovation happens in electrifying things. So we thought we'd need hydrogen for trucks. Well, now I was seeing the other day, I think it was VW now have, 5,000 electric trucks out there. So it's more that, over time we're realizing that hydrogen is a very inefficient way of doing things. We will need it for some stuff. But the role for it will be much smaller than we thought because it's just more expensive.
Interesting. Simon, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the sort of the comments about hydrogen and just other, I guess, gases but materials in more general, and thinking about the role in the future, the possible role of synthetic biology. This idea where we get back to, we already know that there's some bacteria that exists that perhaps digest and eat up plastics. And we know there's bacteria that can produce hydrogen. So I was just thinking that perhaps we might see synthetic biology in the future playing a bigger role. So us manipulating biology to get it to do the things we need it to do.
I mean, yeah, there may be some advances there that will make an impact. For example, we work a little bit on trying to understand vertical farming. And, vertical farming, the plants are very different in vertical farms than they are in very different conditions inside than they are outside. And so really, we need to start optimizing those plants for growth inside. So there are options there. In terms of the synthetic biology for microbes, yeah, there seems to be a lot of opportunities there. But I'm not sure what the learning rates, again, coming back to the learning rates, I'm not sure what they look like in synthetic biology, to be honest.
Well, it's great to hear there might be a role for biochemists, Simon, isn't it?
Maybe I'll still have a job in a few years, eh?
Yeah. So going back to the points about complexity that you stated, one of the things I think you said in the book, and I think collapse, a societal collapse, if hopefully we avoid that, but it's about that loss of complexity. And I think you make a point in the book that there's probably very, very few people on the planet who would know how to make a pencil, all the steps being involved in making a pencil, let alone a toaster. I think was that one of the lines you said, something along those lines?
Yeah.
And then you think about the smartphone, or you think about so many other things. I mean, it's kind of astonishing how complex our civilization is at the moment.
Yeah, that is one of the big questions coming up is if we do get this simplification, how far simplified do we go? Because when previous civilizations have collapsed, they've had to sort of deal with these environmental pressures, for example. They've tried to transition to other technologies or other plants, and that's often failed. So then it's sort of a question of where do they migrate to? So a great example, is ancient Sumeria. So back in Mesopotamian times, and when they were irrigating the fields, they weren't draining them properly, and so they got salination in the field. The salt basically built up in the soils. They tried moving towards barley and towards crops that might be a little bit more resilient to the salt, but that didn't really help. It couldn't maintain the complexity of the society that they lived in, and then they had to migrate. And so then that's the big question is if we start getting all these supply chain disruptions, these environmental interruptions, these climate change interruptions, how far back do we turn the dial? And I don't think people we don't really have a sense of this. It's very science fiction. And it's kind of remarkable that we are living in a science fiction world right now with this. But one thing's for sure, the resilience in general is going to improve the further through these transitions that we go.
So, sorry, what do you mean by that? I see the resilience of the civilization. So even though we remain complex, our civilization would remain resilient.
Yes. So if you think about sort of plant-based diets, for example, we are simplifying the agricultural system massively because in the animal agricultural space, we are growing loads and loads of plants to feed to animals that we eventually eat. And the animals throw away between, 80 to sort of 97% of the calories that we feed them, depending on the product. And so that's food that we can eat directly. And a simplification is actually just to eat the plants and remove that whole complexity, which requires loads of investment, it requires loads of labor. And so if we're able to make that simplified, then we're able to be more resilient. It's a little bit similar in, renewable energies. Arguably, it's harder to sort of make those things, obviously. But once you have the distributed generation of solar and batteries, and we have wind, then you can start thinking about distributed grids. So you can think about grids that can be islanded from larger grids. So you can be more resilient if climate change impacts one area of the grid, then there's more likely to be storage or production on another area of the grid. So some of these things that we know we need to do would make us more resilient.
So if we do that transition to a plant-based diet, there's a load of equipment and a load of infrastructure and a load of jobs associated with animal protein production. So you're going to put all the livestock farmers out of work sort of overnight. I mean, what happens to them? All the
So
milking machines, all of
that's
this sort of stuff.
yeah. So there's a lot of assets. So we've looked at this in research, and these assets, we don't need as many of them. But fortunately, agricultural assets are what's called depreciated over time faster than, say, fossil fuels. So basically, when you buy an asset, you start reducing the value of it as you're using it because it's not a new thing anymore. And agricultural assets tend to be depreciated much faster. So that means that really, as long as we're really clever about this, there shouldn't be these assets left over that people can't use anymore. They should be fully depreciated and basically sort of worthless by the time we've made the transition. In terms of the people in rural landscapes can be employed in so many other different ways for communal goods. So that's actually what's starting to happen in the UK in terms of the environmental land management schemes, for example, where people are being paid instead of having to produce agricultural products, they produce community benefits. So things like biodiversity, floodwater protection, some of the things that we've been talking about. And in the UK, for example, a lot of the animal agricultural sector actually loses money. And so the only reason why they're afloat is because of the subsidies. And so really what we can do is help the farmers with the debts that they currently have, because they'll have debts because of the assets that they're using for animal agriculture. And then we can pay and help them in this transition towards managing the land for biodiversity improvements. That's the theory.
I think sort of, I guess as I'm listening to you, what's coming to me more increasingly is the sort of the inequalities in every sphere actually across the globe. And all I can think of is sort of how this is going to impact different parts of the world in different ways. So the developed world versus, parts of the world that are sort of up and coming, and how we sort of say to people, okay, we've lived this great life and we've had all of these things, and now that you've developed the means to do that and have this life, actually, no, you can't do it.
Yeah.
And so that I think also is going to take careful, I don't want to say management because that doesn't even sound right, but
Navigating.
Yeah, just careful navigation, I think, right?
Yeah, so I think there's two things there. First, it's highly incumbent upon high-income nations to the change. That's why we focus mostly on high-income nations with a dietary change. To be clear, we're not modeling these changes for people who live in food insecurity. We're modeling it for people who are already food secure. Related to that, the development pathways for different regions is highly dominated by both what people see as the good life, but also the institutions and the vested interests in high income nations as well. So they're always looking for new markets, for example, and expanding into those new markets. So we have to be really cognizant of that. I think one of the stats that I always think is quite remarkable is if you were to take the top 10% of income earners and reduce their carbon footprints to the level of the average European, you would reduce total global emissions by a third.
Whoa.
And I don't think that the average European is living that bad a life, really.
Right.
It is pretty. And I think we also have to question a little bit. Yes, we have led these lives, and you and I, we are quite comfortable. But yes, there is an awful lot in our environments, and in our world, which is poisoning us still. So, if you think about some of the development pathways that we've chosen with fossil fuels, yeah, every day we breathe in a bit of diesel, we're basically killing ourselves. Every day we're surrounded by foods which are unhealthy for us ourselves. We're inducing suffering through diabetes, through cardiovascular disease. So we really haven't got things really cracked ourselves. And if you look at the happiness, across different countries, a lot of that is sort of driven, and the well-being is driven by a lot of those inequalities within society, not necessarily across society. So I think there are all these sorts of different questions. And then you've got to zoom out to this very big picture that high income countries and a lot of middle income countries like India are actually now below replacement rate.
Yeah.
So now our countries are actually sort of reducing in size, and quite dramatically. Like China, towards the end of the century, on this current trajectory, will lose about 700 million people.
Yeah,
And
they're down at 1.3 or so, aren't they, in terms of yeah. No,
really,
1.6, I think.
yeah. I mean, South Korea is at like 0.8 or something remarkable, 0.8, 0.9, I read the other day. And so what this means is that
For our listeners, 2.1 is replacement rate, right? So it's a number
yes.
of children each woman has to have, some won't survive because of accidents or what have you. So 2.1 is the replacement rate.
So this is an India dropped below that a couple of years back, and Europe would be losing about 1.5 million active working age people by 2050. So what I sort of zooming out here in terms of this question of like, well, how do lower income people in lower income countries get to live this life? Well, I think one of the clear, obvious answers here is you've got massive climate impacts in those regions. We're responsible for it. Our demographics are changing, and we need a new narrative about migration. And we need a new narrative about well-being and thriving across the world. And I think that's going to be incredibly difficult politically. But if you look across the world and you look at these dynamics, it's quite clear where some of the methods for alleviating suffering will be.
So I could keep talking about this, for hours and hours. It really is fascinating. But we are running out of time. So is there any kind of, I mean, it is fascinating. And over the course of my career, I have to say, it's really noticeable how there's been a change in the number, but also the kind of backgrounds that people come from who are addressing these questions. So, you're a physicist and astronomer who've come in. You're clearly not sort of one of these hippy dippy types that used to be the people driving this forward. And I think, I mean, that has to be a real positive. And actually having physicists and biochemists and chemists and historians and having the whole group of people trying to work out how we do this, I think has to be a point of hope. And I think we should end on a positive from my perspective, that we understand we're starting to really understand what the challenges are, and there are ways that we can do that. And I think I'm going to put those sausages back in the freezer and have beef tonight.
You'll feel very good for it, Tim. I promise. The research shows health-wise, it's really, really good for us. And if I may just say one final thing for people and listeners is, one of the biggest things we have to address is our understanding of one another and the communications about climate change in the environment. And what the research shows over and over again is that people care and want to do things more than you think. So studies from around the world show that, for example, in the US, they ask people, what percentage of people do you think support a carbon tax? And carbon tax is such a dirty word. And they said 32%. And they said, do you support a carbon tax? And the actual support was at 62%. And so over and over again, when we look at this, the support is much higher. And what we also know from that is that if you know that the support is much higher, you're more likely to be outspoken. You're more likely to want to put money towards these transitions, to do these changes. You're more likely to want to go on the journeys yourself, because the thing about, we've been talking about dietary change and so many of these other journeys that we've been talking about, they are journeys. Nobody is saying you have to do everything overnight. It is one step at a time. You see whether you like it, you try a different thing. There's lots of opportunities. There's lots of new ways to be involved. And I think that's where things get really exciting is talking to one another, understanding other people care, and going on these journeys ourselves and feeling much better for it.
Excellent. That seems like a good optimistic place to stop. So, thanks, Paul. That's really fascinating. And for our listeners, we're going to include a link to Paul's book with the podcast. So, yep, take a look down at the bottom of the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks very much. It was lovely talking to you
Wow.
both.
Well, I mean, that was a pretty broad-ranging conversation, Simon. What did you make of that?
I thought it was really interesting and actually I think it was what I expected and what we said at the start, that sort of mix of it, it's serious and we have to do something, but there is optimism if we do things sensibly and efficiently and quickly. So I think it wasn't surprising in many ways, but some of the numbers were, and maybe we can we'll talk about those in a second. That some of those were not just surprising but shocking, I think. But overall, I think the message, I think it was what I expected, and there's work to be done.
I think one of the things that kind of struck me about it is I think we hear so many doom and gloom messages about the state of the planet and the fact that civilization is going to collapse. And those messages are almost overwhelming, I think, for some people some of the time. When you pick up the newspaper and you hear about floods and you hear about famines and crop failures and what have you. And I think some of the kind of messages of hope that you get are kind of a little bit unrealistic, how machine learning is going to save us all. But I thought there was a real level of realism. But
Yes.
within that realism, the fact that, there is opportunity here and actually, it's very difficult. He said, predicting the future is nearly impossible, but laying out the contours of where we go. I thought it was really interesting. And so I came away with actually feeling, probably more positive than I have for some time about some of these environmental issues.
Yeah, agreed. Me too. And I think something that was, I guess, I hadn't thought about was all the different areas of impact. So we think about climate change and we think about sort of food and energy, but it's not just that. It was all the other sort of societal aspects. And, he talked also about changing the narrative around migration. For example, human migration, and hopefully soon we have on the podcast.
Why don't we see if we get Ian Golding on? He'd be good.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to talk about his wonderful book about human migration and the impacts. And I don't know about you, Tim, but I think there's sort of a thread running through our podcast episodes where we see that and we haven't engineered it in that way at all, but there's themes that are sort of almost emerging through some of these.
Well, in talking about threads, even our sponsor, isn't this terrible? That does sound like it's been planned, but it hasn't actually. But even our sponsor, Grace and Garbo, are a sustainability outfit or making sustainable outfits by taking garments that are on their way to to the dump, the tip, and they're giving them a new lease of life. And I'm sorry I haven't got one on today.
I'm sorry you haven't got one on today too.
But before we go, you talked about some of the numbers, and one of them is there are probably more Lego figures than there are people. How many Lego figures do you own, Simon?
I actually, you might joke, but I actually have three little mini Lego figures. And during COVID, when I was giving my lectures online via Zoom, I would take a little Lego figure and place it directly in front of the camera, so the students felt that it was a Lego figure that was lecturing.
There you go. Okay, I don't have any, but so between the two of us, we have three, which is probably pointing to Paul's point that there are more Lego figures than there are people. Anyway, fascinating stuff. Well, have a good rest of the week. I know you've got a very busy week coming up next week with teaching and what have you, so I hope that all goes well. But hopefully, we'll find time to record another podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. See you soon, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.